Hi everybody, my name is Jack Shaw. I am the Regional Manager for Europe at REGENESIS. And I'm here today to introduce our two speakers, Sarah Hughes and Helena Nord, who will be talking about the in situ PFAS remediation in the snow and the application and validation results following the installation of a PlumeStop barrier at a Swedish airport. Just to stress from the beginning, this is a pilot project that we are midway through, so there's more results to come, so there is very much ongoing monitoring. So you could consider this a work in progress. And also this project we completed on behalf of a company called Granitor in Sweden. They were the main contractor, the principal consultant on the project, but they were unable to be part of this presentation today. Just by way of an introduction then, Helena Nord works for Sheeba Environmental, and Sheeba Environmental provided the technical expertise on the technology and the installation of the PlumeStop barrier, and also was undertaking some of the monitoring. Helena is a technical expert within Sheeba and has over 15 years of experience in the contaminated land industry. Sarah Hughes, I'd also like to introduce. Sarah is our district manager for the UK and Scandinavia at REGENESIS. During this project though, Sarah managed and was part of our services team and managed the installation of this barrier. And Sarah has over 7 years experience within the land quality and remediation industry. So before we get started, I'd just like to mention a couple of things, just a bit of housekeeping. Should anyone experience any audio issues or video issues, then often the best thing for you to do is to close down the webinar and log back in again. However, we are recording this webinar, so if those issues persist or you're unable to attend for the whole session, then we can, we will be sharing that recording with everybody that has signed up for this. Finally, if you have any questions, we'll be gathering questions to answer at the end of the webinar, and do add them to the Q&A section in the chat. For any questions that we don't come to, we will provide you with answers at a later date. But without further ado, I'll be handing over to Helena now to continue with the presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I will start with presenting the background to the project and how the site was characterized. And Sarah will talk about the technology that's been chosen, and you'll get an overview on how it was delivered and the initial results. And in the end, a slight glance into the future and the works ahead. Now, this is a picture from the Örnsköldsvik site. This is some of the containers for PlumeStop that has been used to deliver carbon to the ground. So the project is a governmental assignment given to the Swedish Geotechnical Institute, and the task is to evaluate PFAS treatment technologies for Swedish conditions. This assignment will be finally reported in less than 2 years, and therefore it's very important to be able to prove the result, and this has set high demands for the entire project organization. In this assignment, there are 4 different treatment methods: air sparging, thermal treatment, soil washing, and colloidal lactic carbon, that is the topic of today.
So as Helena mentioned, there's 4 different PFAS treatments being considered in the SGI's assignment. And this specific study, which REGENESIS was involved in, looked at the efficacy of treating PFAS impacted groundwater using colloidal activated carbon technology. As such, we considered the applicability of 2 of our technologies, PlumeStop and SourceStop. And I'm just going to run through what these technologies are. So it's a liquid activated carbon, which has been milled to 1 to 2 microns, so that's around the size of a red blood cell. It's suspended as a colloid in a polymer solution, and it distributes widely under low pressure, so there's no need for any high pressure fracturing in your subsurface. It provides extremely fast sorption sites, and it converts the underlying geology into a purifying filter. It doesn't wash out of the aquifer. I'm going to discuss this a little bit more later on in the presentation, and crucially, it's non-toxic.
So the Swedish Geological Institute is sharing this assignment together with the Swedish Geological Survey. They in turn has handed out 2 contracts, one to Helena Filipovic for investigating and monitoring, and that contract is shared with Sheeba Environmental Engineering for technical support and expertise. The other contract is for deployment of the barrier that's been handed to Granitor that has brought with them REGENESIS and Geocompagniet for installing the barrier. So now I'm happy to welcome you to the Öckelvik site, located in the middle of Sweden and marked with the red marker on the map to the left. On the map to the right, you can see the airport located about 25 kilometers northwest of the city center. The yellow ring indicates the firefighting site, and the red ring marks the Torsböle lakes, to which PFAS contaminated has migrated and is now advised not to eat the fish due to the high PFAS content. The site is an active firefighting training site that belongs to the Öckelvik airport. They are since many years now training with non-PFAS firefighting foams, but the foams from the earlier training events has migrated through the Vados zone under the firefighting training site marked with the flame at the top picture, and then down into the groundwater. The groundwater is divided into 3 different bodies marked A, B, and C, and that they are separated by clay layers. Between the clay layers are sandy soils, where PFAS content are up to 140,000 nanograms per liter. The groundwater is about 2.5 to 3 meters below the ground level, but as you can see, a brown area, it upwells into a bog. This barrier has been designed to be placed in the B body, where the PFAS concentrations are the highest. This is a modeling of groundwater flow. At the back of these colors are a red triangle where the firefighting training site is located. And as you can see, the water transports the PFAS in the northwest direction, and that the contents quite far from the firefighting training sites are still quite high. So the site has been characterized throughout many years in different phases. This is some of the extensive characterization investigation that has been going on, but most of the works has been done investigating soil and groundwater, and also emphasis has been placed on hydromodeling as well as monitoring of the groundwater. The results have shown that the groundwater is exceptionally fast, about 0.5 to 1 meter per day. And on the picture to the right, you see the edge of the bog located close to the barrier. And here you have upwelling groundwater that contains about 100,000 nanograms per liter of PFAS.
So with some comprehensive characterization work undertaking over a period of years, I'm just going to run through some of the main site characterization findings. So As Helena mentioned, the effective velocity of the groundwater has a range of over 600 metres per year. And due to this, we had concerns over whether the colloidal activated carbon would fix and what product we would recommend for this high groundwater velocity. So we considered both PlumeStop and SourceStop. We also considered whether we needed to potentially move the barrier to account for down gradient transport due to the fast groundwater velocity. But ultimately, after reviewing the data from 2009, all of it pointed towards us needing to undertake an injection and distribution test to prove our concept. So with that in mind, the team headed to site in early summer 2023, and the objective of our testing was to determine colloidal activated carbon mobility and calcium chloride parking efficacy. So what do I mean by parking? Well, it's the injection of a calcium chloride down gradient of the colloidal activated carbon barrier, and it forces the carbon out of suspension and to sorb onto the aquifer matrix. This prevents down gradient transport of carbon beyond the designed radius of influence, and it can be crucial in a fast groundwater flow, so your barrier doesn't get washed away. So the design of our testings was that we would undertake 3 tests. So we would use PlumeStop unparked, PlumeStop parked, and SourceStop parked. And each test comprised 3 injection points in a line with piezometers installed at varying distances from each line of injection points for groundwater monitoring. So we ran each test for 8 days and sampled from each piezometer multiple times per day to track the colloidal activated carbon in the subsurface. And this enabled us to gather valuable information on the transport and mobility of that carbon, which we used to inform the design of the barrier. And from this, we decided to proceed with our PlumeStop technology. So as part of those characterization works and to further characterize the treatment intervals, we also deployed REGENESIS flux tracers. So these are a passive flux mapping tool, which has been developed by our R&D department. And they are devices which we can use to vertically delineate the contaminant mass flux and groundwater velocity within existing monitoring wells. And you can see one in action on this photo. And that shows the installation of a flux tracer into an existing monitoring well on the Unhusvik site. It was the first time where these flux tracers were deployed in Europe, and upon removal, they were shipped back to our labs in the US for processing and analysis. And really, this helped us to design the barrier in multiple ways. So it provided a strong line of evidence to characterize the full saturated interval. And it also improved our modeling and our confidence in the designed performance of the barrier. So following that site characterization period, which included the colloidal activated carbon distribution testing and the flux tracer deployment I just discussed, we could then design the barrier. And this is what it looked like. So we had 141 PlumeStop injection points in 3 parallel rows, each 1.5 meters apart, which is shown in red on the diagram. And we also had 47 parking agent points 4 meters down gradient of that barrier to prevent the migration of injected colloidal activated carbon, and they're shown in blue. We also split the barrier into 4 zones for better management. So by zoning geographically, we separated the rigs, and so we managed the risk of product returning back to surface during the injection works. We call that daylighting. And it also managed health and safety risk of working in close proximity. As you can see from the photo on the right, all of this was quite challenging when we were working in a forest. We really were limited on space, and we also wanted to cause minimal environmental damage. So we've done the injection tests and we've finalised the design, but then it's time to head out onto site to complete the barrier application. And once we arrived on site, there were a few changes which needed to be made due to the physical conditions that we encountered. Firstly, I'm going to just mention the boundary. So the airport boundary wasn't where the team originally thought. So we had no space in the western extent of the proposed barrier location to install it as per the original design. And we needed to reduce the distance between each row of injection points to fit it into the narrower area that we had to work with. And this presented quite a challenge to us because we needed to retain the full volume of the PlumeStop technology, but that could also result in faster downgradient transport. So these validation wells really came in useful to help us identify when we needed to park that barrier with calcium chloride. We also undertook clay verification. So the design was based on the barrier being installed to the inferred top of the clay layer at around 1.5 meters below ground level. So on the top image here, you can see the clay layer denoted in a dark brown colour, with all 4 zones designed to be treated at the same depths. And prior to the works, we undertook a verification auger in the centre point of each of the 4 zones, just to confirm the depth to clay and thus the injection horizons that we needed to inject to. And you can see the results of that clay layer verification in the bottom image. So zones 1 and 2, the clay actually came in around where we thought that it should, but in zones 3 and 4, it came in a little bit deeper than we'd anticipated. So we had a bigger treatment horizon in those areas. And we needed to amend the injection horizons according to this to make sure that we treated from the top of that clay layer to above the mean high groundwater level to capture the entire aquifer. And we also amended the injection volumes accordingly.
So the site works as Sarah described were adjusted to the thickness of the treatment zone, and also we relocated some of the investigation points in order to keep within the airport's property boundaries. Now, as governmental assignment has a final date when it needs to be reported, the project needed as long monitoring period as possible after injection, and therefore the barrier was decided to be installed as soon as possible. That work started therefore in September, where fall has already come to Örnsköldsvik, and they continued for a little bit over 2 months and ended in late November. By that time, winter had arrived, and as you can see, we have some substantial amounts of snow. Now the graph below, the light blue one is the minimum temperature, and the dark blue line is the maximum temperature of each day, and these are official meteorological readings from the airport's meteorological station. Now, this site was actually colder because it was shaded from the side by an embankment at one of the sides of the barrier, and therefore the sun couldn't warm the site up until after lunch. Now, the cold also came with other challenges. So everything needs to be stored about freezing. For example, PlumeStop aren't allowed to freeze, and therefore the contractor set up a tent with heating fans where all the product could be stored, and the freezing indicators were checked every day. The drilling rigs were also stored either in the tent or in the truck overnight. All mixing equipment and hoses were winterproofed, and the injectate kept flowing to prevent the freezing. The cold actually also helped the project as the ground froze, the daylighting were kept to a minimum, although over 500,000 liters were injected. As this is in a part of Sweden where most of the site crew didn't live, they lived further south. They had long trips to be deployed to the site, and therefore They worked for 10-day injection periods, and then they went home and had a break and a rest, and then they came back and did another 10 days, and then they kept going like that until the project was finished. The site crew was 2 to 5 drilling rigs with their operating. There was a site manager and mixing staff on site, and an injection expert from REGENESIS full-time present during the injection works. And Sarah actually did most of that time on site. Also, Sheeba had a technical specialist that visited the site every week.
So as part of the barrier installation works, we also undertook placement validation, and that was required to ensure that PlumeStop was behaving as we expected in the subsurface. So throughout the works, 14 monitoring wells were installed at the request of REGENESIS, and we also utilised pre-existing monitoring wells. As you can see on the image on screen, we had quite a few to choose from. The role of these wells, it was really to assess down gradient transport, placement validation of the carbon, that we were achieving the designed radius of influence from each of those injection points, and that PlumeStop concentrations within groundwater were as expected, and that we were achieving midpoint distribution between each of the injection points as well. We also used it to assess a parking agent function to make sure that it was helping the carbon to settle out of suspension. Many of the wells were strategically placed to have dual function, so they could be used throughout the works to monitor various aspects. And in total, we took 162 samples from these wells, and each sample was subjected to a colorimetric test to determine the concentration of PlumeStop in the groundwater at that location. And it was also compared against a known REGENESIS standard.
So now we're happy to share some of the results with you. So these two maps are showing the barrier location in yellow, and on the map to the left we can see reduction within the first approximate 6 months. The purple dots are groundwater wells where we have at least 76% reduction. And please note that the groundwater is flowing from the bottom of the map and throughout the barrier and up in the northwest direction. So the up gradient wells, they have not been treated, so therefore they have no reduction. And the down gradient wells that are still blue at the top of the map is wells where the treated groundwater has not arrived yet. If you look at the particular well in the map to the right, you can see that once the barrier is installed, the PFAS concentrations drop significantly and very fast. So now I will show you a series of maps over the concentrations at different places of the site. These are all layouted in the same way. So if you look at the bars, the green fields are the precursors and the brownish ones are PFAS. The darker the color, the longer the chain. And for the blue one, it's the same, but it is PFCAs instead. And these are samplings of incoming water into the barrier, and therefore it varies a little bit. But they are generally quite high, with spikes over 200,000 nanograms per liter. So here are monitoring wells inside the barrier, and you can see that once the barrier is installed, the concentrations drop significantly. Now here is the first set of wells down gradient, the barrier. Here we can see a dropping concentration at the beginning of the new year. And as the groundwater keeps flowing through the barrier and down gradient, the concentrations keeps dropping. Even further down gradient, you see the concentrations also decreasing, but it takes a little longer time because the distance of the groundwater passing the barrier is even longer. Looking at the single well and the reduction of different PFASs, the bars at the top right, here you can see about a 90% reduction from December to January, and as much until the reading in February. Looking at the different PFAS groups, you can see the PFCAs also had decreased a lot, and to the left you have short-chain PFASs and precursors that are reduced in the same manner.
So what does the future look like for this site? Well, monitoring is expected to continue throughout 2025, and the SGI will update their hydrogeological model on completion of this monitoring period. On completion of the assignment in 2026, the SGI will report on the applicability of each technology that they assessed, and the results of that will be published. So in conclusion then, PlumeStop colloidal activated carbon technology is a suitable method for remediation of sites with high concentrations of PFAS, and we've observed up to a 99% reduction in PFAS down gradient of the barrier at 4 months, with reductions still ongoing over time. The risk to down gradient receptors can be removed in a safe, effective and sustainable way using this colloidal activated carbon technology. And also close collaboration between Sheeba, REGENESIS and the entire project team enabled completion of this pilot study in a targeted and methodical manner. And we were also able to collect valuable data for further assessment by the SGI. So I'll hand back to Jack now, and hopefully maybe we've got some questions.
Hi everyone, thank you Sarah and Helena, that was really great. I actually had forgotten how high those concentrations were that were coming into the barrier, so no, that was excellent. I've tried to scribble down as much as possible in trying to group them into themes, so sorry if your question might not be read out as exactly as it's been written. Helena, the first question I suppose is for yourself. And that is, what were sort of the objectives of this trial? It was part of a much wider sort of government-funded trial, I suppose. What were the objectives on this particular site that you were looking to achieve?
Well, the main objective is to show proof of concept for colloidal active carbon on PFAS in Sweden and under Sweden's conditions. And that is also why we have had such extensive investigation and monitoring on this site, just to be able to, so that we are very sure that we can show the proof of concept that is intended.
I think that's quite an important thing to mention. It's certainly being extensively monitored and validated that, you know, probably to a degree at which you wouldn't expect to see on a lot of commercial applications. So, you know, everybody involved is very much drilling into the science of it. Sort of, I mentioned at the beginning that this is very much a work in progress and more information is always coming out. Again, one for you, Helena. How can people sort of follow the progress of this project? I guess it might be a bit tricky for those that aren't Swedish speaking, but yeah.
Yes. Well, SGI has a webinar series in Sweden, and for Sweden in Swedish. They have had one for the Örnsköldsvik site, and I think that another one is planned for the future. And these are also possible to see, to watch the recordings afterwards for those that are interested. And this webinar series also contain all the 4 governmental assignments.
Excellent. Sarah, perhaps a couple for you, and I might jump in with some of them as well. The first question was, you know, the weather conditions that were encountered, certainly for British people, kind of extreme. How was that managed and sort of prepared for?
Yeah, sure. So Helena kind of mentioned it a little bit in the presentation, but really the key was planning for the weather conditions. So We anticipated that it would get quite cold. However, we didn't anticipate that it would reach -21 Celsius at the end of the site works. So what we had on site was a setup with heated tents that had fans in them, and we stored all of our product and the drilling rigs in those. So the product stayed in it throughout the duration of the works, and the drilling rigs were stored in there overnight. And that had temperature monitors in there as well to make sure it didn't drop below freezing. I think we maintained a temperature of around 8 Celsius in there. All of the injection hoses, they were fully insulated before the onset of the cold weather. And the product as well, it was constantly agitated within the mixing tanks when it was being mixed with water, and also recirculated through all pumps, so it wasn't able to freeze. At the end of every working day, the injection hoses were drained completely to make sure that nothing froze overnight, but the mixing tanks were agitated throughout the night as well.
Yeah. Draining hoses is something I've forgotten to do when I've been working on cold sites, and yeah, everyone else wasn't best pleased. But anyway, sort of building on that a little bit then, fairly complicated barrier to install. I think I counted well over 180 injection points. How was the data managed around all of that? How were you able to keep good enough records, particularly in the context of this project, I suppose, to satisfy all the different stakeholders? So there was a few questions on sort of data management that came through.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, like we've mentioned throughout the presentation, data management and the provision of data for this proof of concept was really key for this study. So we had the SGI also working on site. We had the sampling teams as well. So there was a lot of data flying around. But from REGENESIS' side, we actually used Open Ground Geotechnical Data Management System whilst we were on site to record every injection point. So the data that we collected was the injection point's location, its injection horizon, so the target treatment zone, the volume that was injected, and the pressure and flow rate which it was injected under. And we also recorded any instances of product surfacing or any change of injection tips, any difficulties with drilling down to depth. And all of that was captured in the field on a tablet. And the way that the software worked is that it would automatically sync to the software on the laptop. So those back in the UK and in the office could also keep tabs on the progress of the project by checking in every day into the software to see what had been done and whether we'd encountered any issues.
That's great, thank you. Maybe one for Helena, though it's a very complicated project structure. You know, we in REGENESIS in this case, we were working for a company called Granitor. But Helena, if you can answer this one, do you know why this particular site was selected for this trial?
Well, this site was selected before the contract was awarded, but as I've understood, it is a complex site. It has high concentrations, a high groundwater velocity, but it also have good possibilities of working with active carbon. For example, you have sandy soils that are well defined by clay layers, and it also is a very large site. And as we have shown, this barrier that is actually 70 meters long is only a part of the plume. So I mean, there are good conditions for proving the efficiency of a carbon barrier.
Perfect. This is a variant on one of the questions that came through. Who's doing the monitoring of this? I mean, I know we're not. We don't tend to. Within the the project group? Is there a particular consultant doing the monitoring?
Yes, all of the monitoring and investigations are led by Helena Filipovic and their crew, and they have been extensively on site to provide all of the other project partners with this very large data set and monitoring both before and after the injection works.
Sort of, again, kind of related to that, beyond just groundwater modeling, monitoring rather, modeling is the next question, monitoring, are there any other sort of activities planned on the project?
Well, continued monitoring of the barrier is a large one, and then there are some additional investigation planned, but there are also always new things that the project would like to investigate, and we'll need to see what will lie ahead.
No problem. I think that really wraps up most of the questions. So thank you so much, Helena, for making the time to give this presentation with Sarah and for ourselves. Just before we log off, just a few final things. In the next hour or so, everyone will receive an email with an attendance certificate already attached. So if you are looking to evidence continual professional development, you can use that. So you don't have to request this separately. Within this email, there'll also be a link to a short feedback survey, and it would be really useful for us if you could complete that. We're always keen to know how our webinars have been received, but also what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. And if you can think of a good topic, or if you would like to volunteer as a guest speaker, do feel free to reach out to myself or either Sarah. But also everybody's contact details, they're available right now up on the screen. So if you do have any questions, please do not feel free to either reach out to myself, Sarah, or Helena. But again, thank you very much, Helena and Sarah, for giving this talk. I'll say goodbye to everyone, and yeah, looking forward to speaking to you soon. Cheers then.